Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm doing a bit of an odd wrap-up, which is a 5-star TBR predictions wrap-up, plus I'm going to do a list of, sort of TBR list for my next round of 5-star TBR predictions, sort of based off this one. So 5-star TBR predictions is a thing that's gone around booktube a lot, originally created by Mercedes from Mercy's Bookish Musings. The idea is to pick a list of books that you think are going to be 5-star reads for you, and then to see how right you were or not. So I came up with this list of 5 books back like at the beginning of November, when I realized that I had had very few 5-star reads so far at that point in 2018, and I wanted to find a few more by the end of the year. And I will tell you right off the bat, it basically did that for me. I found 2 more 5-star reads, which did not catch me up to how many 5-star books I wanted to have read in the year, but I found 2 5-star reads before the end of the calendar year. And then the 3 that I ended up reading here in the first few months of this year, 2019, all ended up being 4-star reads, so even if I had read them by the end of 2018, that would not have actually increased my number of 5-star reads of the year. So this is where I'm going to be doing my primary wrap-ups for these books. I haven't done my wrap-ups yet for any of the months I read them in, and I think doing this now will make those wrap-ups easier and less intimidating for me to film, because I still am going back and trying to catch up on those wrap-ups. So the first book from my 5-star TBR predictions list that I ended up reading was Blanca y Roja by Anna Marie McLemore, which I thought would be 5 stars because both of the other 2 books by this author that I had read were 5-star reads for me, When the Moon Was Ours and Wild Beauty. And this one did make that 5 stars for me. It is not my favorite of hers, that's still Wild Beauty, but I think of this being kind of on par with When the Moon Was Ours. So this, like all of McLemore's books, is a standalone YA fantasy/magical realism novel. But this one deals very explicitly with fairy tales, and it uses fairy tales as a way to sort of deconstruct ideas of sisterhood and of femininity, and also race and colorism. This has McLemore's sort of trademark focus on both Latinx and LGBTQ characters, and her very beautiful lyrical writing. I talked about this book in greater detail in a video where I sort of compared and contrasted it with another book with some similar themes that I had recently read, which was The Sisters of the Winter Wood by Rena Rosner. So I'm going to link that video for you and move on. In December, I read, finally at last, The Girl Who Raced Fairyland All the Way Home by Catherynne and Valente, which is the 5th and final book in her Fairyland series. This was also a 5-star read for me, which was predictable because all of the previous books in this series have been 5-star reads for me. I just love her narrative tone of these and her sort of whimsy and wisdom. And these are also just wildly, boldly imaginative. This book follows on the heels of events in the 4th book, The Boy Who Lost Fairyland, which was primarily not about the main protagonist of the series, September, but about a boy who is a troll who grows up in the human world as a changeling. But the characters from that book meet September in Fairyland towards the end, and then something happens that starts the events of this book. And basically what the story of this book is a race, except in a fairyland, a race is not exactly a race. It's something far more complicated, for the crown of Fairyland. September has found herself sort of accidentally queen of Fairyland, but it turns out not for long, because all of the previous rulers of Fairyland have been revived, and a lot of them want the crown back for themselves. The only way to settle this is to have a race for the crown of Fairyland. There's some interesting commentary here on power and why people want it. September doesn't think that she really wants wanted to be Queen of Fairyland, but she ends up participating in the race anyways, and she doesn't want to lose. And she's got the kind of feeling that it's not quite fair that now that she's Queen of Fairyland, she has to give it up right away. So we follow September and her friends as they compete in this race to find the heart of Fairyland, whatever that may be, and no one really knows what the heart of Fairyland is. So throughout most of this book, we're adventuring around Fairyland, sort of on a quest, interrupted every so often by the sort of bizarre rules of the game. And for a long time, I was not quite certain that this was working for me as well as the other books. Not much about the race itself was really all that, like, 5-star great for me, even though I was enjoying it. The interludes in this book, however, follow September's parents and her aunt, who have figured out that she's in Fairyland and are going to try and find her. I thought that was fascinating, and I wanted more of it, because the interludes in these books are very, very short. I wanted, like, longer chunks of September's parents, and I wanted less of the race. However, the ending of this book got me hard. It was not what I was anticipating at all. I sort of thought I had it figured out, and I was totally wrong, and I loved it. So this did come out and surprise me at the end to be a 5-star read. The one thing that I will mention that I think could have made my reading experience of this better is that I ended up reading it quite a long time after reading the first 4 books in the series, and I had forgotten some stuff that I think ended up being important. Especially, I think there were things from the second book that I didn't remember, because I think I remember the second book least well of all 5. And so I would kind of suggest maybe reading them closer back to back than I did if you are reading this series. So now on to the ones that ended up being 4-star reads. First, in December, I read Lud-in-the-Mist. This is what I was reading over Christmas, and I thought it was, I mean, it's not a Christmas book in any way, shape, or form, but it felt kind of nice for the season. It felt kind of cozy. This is a fantasy novel from 1926, and I am enjoying reading some older, like, pre-Tolkien fantasy classics, and I want to continue to do so because it's been going pretty well for me. This is set in a fictional country called Doraemare, which seems to maybe be in a fantasy world, given that I don't think any real places are mentioned, but there's not really any elaborate world building beyond some of the history of this one small country and its capital port city, Lud-in-the-Mist. This is a country that was long ruled by a sort of decadent aristocracy, and then the Duke was overthrown and replaced by a new government of the wealthy merchant class. But Doraemare shares a border with Fairyland, and while the aristocracy and the Duke, who was overthrown, Duke Aubrey, were known to have had relations with Fairyland and to have, like, imported fairy fruit and such, nowadays even so much as the mention of fairy is frowned upon. Basically, by legal fiction, you're supposed to just pretend that it doesn't exist. And there's a lot about legal fictions and what sort of legally does not exist in this book, even though it's obviously there and right under your nose. There's also, like, this sort of mass hysteria about fairy fruit being smuggled across the border, and how the youths are getting their hands on fairy fruit and becoming debauched on fairy fruit. That just seems like perpetually timely. But the main character of this book is the mayor of Lud-in-the-Mist. His name is Nathaniel Chanticleer, and he discovers that his young son, who has become ill or somewhat distressed in the mind, may have eaten fairy fruit, oh horrors. And he is both trying to find a cure for his son and to figure out how the fairy fruit is being smuggled into Lud-in-the-Mist. Nathaniel confides in a doctor named Endymion Lear and turns to him for guidance, but Endymion Lear may be playing a very different game, and it may not be what he appears to be. Who is he? What does he want? What is he trying to do? That's all part of the mystery of this book. There's a good deal of this that feels very Fantasy of Manners to me, very focused on social propriety, and how mention of magic and Fairyland and fairy fruit is a breaking of all of these very artificial social norms. We also get a plotline that involves the finishing school where Nathaniel's daughter Prunella is enrolled, along with all of the other upper-class daughters of Lud's society. I do like that the magic in this book is very mysterious. There's a lot of music in it. There's a sort of sense that magic is music and vice versa. There's also sort of the implication that Fairyland might be like the land of the dead, that fairies might be those who have gone on to the afterlife. But there are a couple different mysteries here that make it feel very much like a mystery story. One, the fairy fruit smuggling, and two, there's sort of this murder mystery that ends up happening. So there were a lot of different threads of this book that I really liked. I was not, however, at the end, like, totally wowed by how they all came together. I think I sort of still had some questions. Specifically, I felt a little bit iffy about the connection of magic with this decadent nobility, and by the end I wasn't quite sure how I was sort of supposed to feel about the more socioeconomic, messaging of the book. Maybe I was trying to read too much into it, and that's why I didn't quite understand what I was getting, I guess. I don't know. Anyhow, I really liked reading this as a, history of the fantasy genre thing. It was right up my alley in many, many ways. It was not quite a 5-star read for me. I want to mention that, I was kind of comparing this in my mind to The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany, because that was published around a very similar time. Comparing the writing styles, this is way more accessible reading than Lord Dunsany. It was the 1920s. There are some things that feel a little archaic about the writing style, but it's mostly much lighter. It took me a little while to get into, but after I'd gotten through the beginning chunk, it felt like much more modern, easy reading than I was expecting from a fantasy novel of this era. Anyhow, that was Lud-in-the-Mist, and it got 4 stars from me. Very good, super happy to have read it, not quite a 5. Next, all the way jumping to a book that I started at the end of December, but because of life reasons did not finish until the beginning of this month. This is A Conspiracy of Truths by Alexandra Rowland, which I was going out on a limb a bit putting this on my 5-star TBR predictions video, because this is a debut novel from an author that I didn't know much about until this book came out. This is, again, one I'm super glad to have read. It's very much my thing in a lot of ways, but it wasn't quite 5 stars. This is a fantasy book with, a lot of big political intrigue and stuff, but it's told in a very non-traditional way. Because basically everything that happens in this story is being related to us by the first-person narrator, who was being held a prisoner of some sort or another pretty much the entire time, and saw none of it happen directly, even though he maybe caused all of it. So the main character of this book, our narrator, is a crotchety, grumpy old man who goes by the title of Chant. It is a title, not a name. It is his profession, his calling. He is a chant. And basically he is a traveling storyteller in a tradition of chants who travel the world and gather stories and tell them to spread, human wisdom or whatever. But at the beginning of this book, he and his apprentice Ilfing have come to a country called Nurievet, which seems to have very little imagination and a whole ton of bureaucracy. In Nurievet, Chant has been arrested on suspicion of being a black witch, and is soon charged with some other things, including espionage. Basically, no one here understands what he does, so the assumption all around is that it must be nefarious. He seems to have very little going for him. The legal system is very, very complicated, and his lawyer does not particularly seem to like him. But his case becomes interesting to people in power, so it gives him an opportunity to sort of start spinning stories to influential people, and telling them what he thinks they will want to hear that will make them think he can be useful to them. Basically, in Nuriavet, there are 5 elected heads of government for 5 different branches of government, but there is so much corruption and suspicion. So the system is actually a whole lot more fragile than it appears. As someone who gets very, very nervous when characters start like spinning tales that are obviously going to backfire on them later, the first portion of this book made me very, very, very concerned. But then there is a point where Chant does sort of realize what he is doing and that he has absolutely nothing to lose, and he does start acting somewhat more purposefully, with even greater consequences. The message here is sort of like, if your political system can be felled by one grumpy old dude self-servingly telling stories in a prison, your political system was probably not very strong to begin with, now was it? Now, the reason that I say that this is a very unusually told fantasy story is that this does have some of these big political machinations and large-scale consequences for a country, but it does all happen off-screen because Chant is the one who is telling us about it. And he has, a lot of the time, only second or third-hand knowledge of what is happening outside his prison as a result of some of the things he has done. I feel like I have a lot of opinions and strong feelings about books where, like this one, a lot of what you would think of as the main action of a traditional fantasy novel happens off-screen, and we get something, you know, on the page that is much more a character study. I can think of several books and series that have done this in ways that I've really, really liked. So it's something that fascinates me, but I don't think this pulled it off quite as well as I was hoping. I think for it to work really well, there has to be a very strong character arc for the characters that you're actually spending on-page time with. And Chant is a very entertaining character to read about. His mentor relationship with his apprentice Ilfing is very enjoyable. He absolutely will not admit ever to how much he actually cares about Ilfing, but it's obvious that he does. But I don't think as a character Chant had quite enough of an emotional arc for me. There's a lot about him and about reading from his point of view that stays very much the same throughout, even while really dramatic events are happening around him. And so it didn't quite have as much of an emotional impact on me as a character-driven fantasy novel as I would want it to have. So I think that's where it didn't quite make the 5 stars, in my opinion. But there are a lot of other things about this book that I liked that I want to touch on. So this is a book, part of the reason why it was on my 5-star TBR predictions in the first place, that has stories within stories, and that is just one of the things that I just eat it up in fiction, especially in fantasy. So you get some stories that Chant tells, and also some stories that other people tell, as sort of just inserts into the story. And they didn't all necessarily relate and come together as part of the bigger picture, as well as some sort of stories about storybooks that I've read have, but each of the stories themselves is quite fun to read. It feels a little bit like a novel that is occasionally peppered with short fairy tale-ish, folklore-ish fiction. There are also a lot of things I like about the world building of this book. You get a sense with Chant as the narrator of really quite a large and varied world in this secondary fantasy world that is out there. How different places he's been have very different social norms, different types of magic. This is a very magic-light fantasy. There isn't a lot of magic in it, but you do get the sense that, like, magic is a cultural thing in this world, that you have different magic in a place depending on the culture. There's also definitely LGBTQ representation in here. Family structures are traditionally different in different places that Chant has visited and knows about. In Nur-Yvet, there tend to be these large polyamorous marriages. Even though they're not necessarily marriages of love, many of them are marriages for economic or business purposes. But queer relationships and bisexuality are absolutely the norm. Ylfing is definitely gay. He is a character who falls in love quite earnestly and rather frequently. Ylfing is definitely a highlight of this book. I'd say that he actually has more of that emotional journey and character development over the course of the book than Chant does. And I believe that the sequel that will be coming out is focused on Ylfing as the main character. So that makes me very eager to read that book because I want to read more about him and I do want to read more about this world. I think I might have been grumpy a little bit about how this book ended had I not known by the time I got to the end that there will be a sequel, that we will learn more about some of these characters. Partway through, you start to realize that there is a specific person that Chant is telling this story to, sort of in the second person, I'm telling this story to you, but that person is a character within the story who we don't learn who that is until quite late, and why he's telling that story to that person. And in the end, I sort of wanted to know more about what happened there. But I think this is a very enjoyable book. It's fresh and unusual. It is different. It does feel timely. There's something about it that feels very much like a book published in 2018. I can't quite imagine this book having been published several years ago. I don't know how it will hold up in years to come, but I enjoyed it. I'd recommend it. I gave it 4 stars, not quite 5. And then the last book on this list I finished, I think just yesterday as I'm filming this, and that is Winter Rose by Patricia A. McKillip. This is a loose Tam Lin retelling published in 1996, and this is a sort of fantasy writing that I personally am very comfortable and familiar with, given that I was raised on books like Robin McKinley's fairy tale retellings. This has a similar sort of style to it, and so in a lot of ways, reading a book like this feels like coming home to me. But I'm not sure that's how a broader audience will see something like this. Like, I scroll through Goodreads reviews of this book, and it leaves a lot of people very confused. They don't know what happened in it. They don't know what the ending meant. And yet none of that was particularly confusing to me, because I think I'm kind of used to this sort of storytelling where magic is completely inexplicable. It happens on a completely different, plane of reality. Reality itself has many faces. It's very lyrical, it's very dreamlike. Things that happen in dreams are maybe just as real as things that happen not in dreams. This is sort of fundamentally how I expect my fairy tale novels to be. And I think I am weird that way. But this is fundamentally a small town family story in a very non-specific setting. The main character is a girl or young woman whose name is spelled R-O-I-S, and I'm not 100% certain on how to pronounce it, but my best guess is going to be Rosh. Rosh is sort of a wild child. She spends a lot of time in the woods. She seems to have a very, very strong connection with the natural world. She lives with her father and her sister, and their family becomes entwined with the story of the Lynn family. The Lynns are the long-absent owners of Lynn Hall, which has fallen to ruin in the woods. But one fall, the young and enigmatic Corbett Lynn returns to the town to take up his family legacy and rebuild Lynn Hall. To most of the town, this seems like a pretty mundane occurrence, except that Rosh saw Corbett Lynn manifest out of a beam of light and walk out of the woods. Pretty soon, the town gossips are all abuzz with rumors of the Lynn family curse, which the older members of the community all seem to remember, but they all seem to remember it differently. Corbett starts to spend time with Rosh's family, but she seems to be the only person who can sort of see the threads of the sort of otherworldly things that are going on with this situation. And she finds herself drawn into investigating further into the Lynn family's connection with this magical otherworld as well as her own. Can she save Corbett from the Lynn family curse, and can she prevent him from dragging her family down with him? So this is a lovely story that takes place over the course of a winter, from fall into spring. It is still not my favorite thing I have read by McKillip. I have not disliked anything I've read by Patricia McKillip so far, but my favorite is still The Bell at Sealy Head, which I think is an odd favorite, but I think something like The Bell at Sealy Head has more sort of vibrant human warmth to it than something like this. I think from the things of McKillip's I've read, I can kind of map a progression of her writing style from like very old-fashioned-y, highfalutin fantasy writing through something like this that's a very gentle fairy tale retelling, but still takes itself very seriously onto sort of fresher, more modern things. And I like all of it. I intend to read McKillip's entire backlist. But if the question is this 5 stars for me? Not quite. I think the other reason this couldn't quite be a 5-star read for me when I read it is that there is a good deal in this about the dead mother, and the way that was handled in this book, I just wasn't quite ready for it. So 4 stars for Winter Rose. So now these were the books from that round of 5-star TBR predictions. These were the ones that were 5 stars, but none of them were real misses. So what I'd like to do, because I am still not finding enough 5-star reads in the books that I am reading, is I would just like to continue on with another batch of 5-star TBR predictions that I'm going to start working into my reading over the next few months. So I have 5 books picked out here, and the way I've decided which ones I'm going to pick based on this batch is that I was looking at what do the things that were 5-star reads for me in this batch, these 2, what do they have in common? They have 2 things in common. 1, they are both either YA or middle grade, but 2, they are also both books from authors who I had previously given 5-star ratings to their books before. So I was thinking I could do either of those as a theme, either YA and middle grade, or authors who have previously been 5-star authors for me, and the latter I was just finding a much more interesting stack of books for. So these are all books from authors whose books I have rated 5 stars in the past. And to start off with, I immediately picked one more book from each of these authors. From Anna-Marie McLemore, she only has one more book that I have not read, which is her debut novel, The Weight of Feathers. So this is one I want to get to soon. I think all things considered, there's a pretty good chance that this will be a 5-star read for me. And I have several of Catherynne M. Valente's books from her backlist that I have not gotten to, that I am ashamed that I have not read. The one that shames me most, because it is most my thing, and people are frequently surprised that I have not read this one, is Deathless. This one is a standalone historical Russian fairy tale retelling. Why on earth have I not read this yet? And next, even though Winter Rose was not a 5-star read for me, it did leave me, having finished it just yesterday, really itching to read more McKillip, because this is just so comfortable and wonderful for me, and it made me wish I'd read more of her things already, and it made me want to immediately dive into more of the books of hers that I have. So the one that I've picked is The Bards of Bone Plain, and this is the book of hers on my TBR that I've owned the longest, so it's sort of the default next to McKillip for me. But I also think that this is a good choice because, as I was saying, I seem to have more of an affinity for some of McKillip's more recent writing. The Bell at Sealy Head, which was my 5-star read from McKillip that I've read previously, was published, I think, in 2008, and this one was published in 2010, only 2 years after that. So I'm hoping that this will be a similar type of read to that one. I think this is about a scholar who is studying this legendary place called Bone Plain, and I love fantasy academia. I like it a lot, so I'm very pumped about this. Next, I have a short story collection, and this is The Ladies of Grace Adieu and Other Stories by Susanna Clarke. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell has been one of my absolute favorite books I've read in recent years, and this is the only other thing that Susanna Clarke has published. I think if there is any story collection that would get a 5-star rating from me, it would be hers. And then the last book on this list is Among Others by Jo Walton. This is on this list because I feel it's just one of those books that I should have read long ago and haven't. I believe it will be very different from the Jo Walton book that I've given 5 stars, which was The Philosopher Kings, which was the middle book in the Thessaly trilogy. But I've actually had people in my real life recently telling me I should read this book because they want to talk to me about it. And also, it happens to be the book that's been on my Goodreads TBR for the longest. So it is really long past time. And when I look at this stack of books as a stack of 5 TBR books, this just looks like I can't go wrong. This looks like a stack of books that's very, very me. And especially with like award season where I feel like I have a lot of pressure on me to read things that I wouldn't necessarily otherwise pick up, I think it's important for me to keep feeding in to my TBR some of these backlist books that I think are really going to hit the mark for me. So those were the 5-star predictions books I've read from November until now, and another batch of them. Let me know if you've read any of these books, and if so, what you think. Let me know how you're doing. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.